In the rain-lashed fields outside Pokrovsk in Donetsk Oblast, something horrifying is happening to Russian soldiers right now. Entire assault groups are disappearing without a trace, not retreating, not surrendering, simply vanishing. One minute their radios are alive with the static of an advance, the next, absolute silence, no final transmission, no bodies for recovery teams to find, just empty foxholes, abandoned equipment, and the Ukrainian drones still circling overhead like vultures that have already fed. This is not the fog of war. This is not normal battlefield attrition. What you are witnessing is the live demonstration of a Russian doctrinal collapse, so complete that entire units are being erased from existence before they can even register on their own command maps. Ukrainian forces have turned the approach to the front lines into a kill zone so efficient, so invisible, that Russian soldiers are walking into it and ceasing to exist as coherent fighting formations. Let that sink in for a moment. I spent decades commanding forces across Europe. I have studied every major conflict since the Second World War. I have never seen a modern army lose soldiers at this scale with so little trace left behind. And make no mistake, this is not an isolated tactical setback in Donetsk. This is proof that Ukraine has adapted faster, thought deeper, and executed more ruthlessly than the Russian high command ever imagined possible. Their assumptions about massed infantry, artillery dominance, and sheer numbers have been exposed as fatal delusions. And what happens next changes everything. Pull the lens back with me. For months, the Kremlin has bet everything on the grinding meat grinder strategy in Donetsk. They believed that if they simply poured enough bodies into the sector, waves of convicts, mobilized reservists, contract soldiers, they could overwhelm Ukrainian defenses through sheer volume. They assumed their artillery would suppress Ukrainian fire, their electronic warfare would blind Ukrainian drones, and their command structure would maintain control even under pressure. They told themselves that Donetsk was the decisive theater where Russian numerical superiority would finally deliver the breakthrough they desperately need. Those assumptions were wrong from the first day. What the Russians failed to understand, and what Ukrainian commanders grasped early, is that modern warfare has fundamentally changed. The battlefield is no longer dominated by the side with the most tanks or the most artillery shells. It is dominated by the side that controls the air with small, cheap, lethal systems. And Ukraine has turned that truth into a science. Let me walk you through exactly how this horror unfolded. It started with small reconnaissance groups, Russian platoons of 30 to 40 men probing forward under the cover of their own smoke and artillery. They would move in tight formations, exactly as their Soviet-era doctrine taught them, shoulder to shoulder, relying on mass to push through. Ukrainian operators, watching in real time through commercial quadcopters and advanced FPV drones, simply waited. The moment those soldiers crossed an invisible digital line, usually 2 to 3 kilometers from the Ukrainian positions, the drones descended. First came the spotters, marking exact coordinates. Then the strike packages, dozens of FPV drones armed with shaped charges, fragmentation munitions, and thermobaric warheads. Russian soldiers never saw them coming. The strikes were surgical, overwhelming, and relentless. One soldier vaporized, another shredded beyond recognition, a third buried under the collapsing remains of a trench. Within minutes, an entire platoon was gone. No wounded left screaming for help because the follow-on strikes made sure there were no survivors to scream. And here is the truly horrifying part, because the bodies were so completely destroyed or scattered across contested ground, Russian recovery teams could not reach them. Ukrainian drone operators made certain of that. Any attempt at evacuation triggered more strikes. So the dead remained where they fell, unrecoverable, unidentifiable, simply erased from the official count. Families back in Russia would later receive nothing but a terse missing in action notification. No body, no closure, just another ghost added to the growing list of the disappeared. By late February and into March 2026, this pattern had scaled dramatically. Russian losses in Donetsk reached record levels, over 35,000 confirmed casualties in a single month, with some estimates putting the density at 316 soldiers per square kilometer in the most contested sectors. Entire companies of 120 men were entering the approach corridors and simply vanishing. Radio logs showed units reporting on the move at 04:30 hours, then nothing. Command posts would query for status updates and receive only static. When follow-up drone reconnaissance finally reached the area, the ground was littered with twisted metal and charred earth, but the soldiers themselves had been turned into dust and memory. The Russian High Command responded exactly as their outdated doctrine demanded. They doubled down. They sent in larger formations. They increased the frequency of these human wave assaults. They ordered their troops to advance without adequate reconnaissance, without proper electronic countermeasures, without even basic drone protection, and each time the result was the same. More platoons, more companies, more ghosts. Ukrainian adaptation, by contrast, was relentless and precise. They integrated commercial off-the-shelf drones with military-grade electronic warfare systems. They developed night-capable FPV variants that operated in the same low-visibility conditions the Russians once thought would protect them. They created autonomous hunter-killer teams that could loiter for hours waiting for the next wave. They even began using AI-assisted targeting that allowed a single operator to control multiple strike packages simultaneously. The asymmetry was breathtaking. Russia was still fighting a 20th century war of mass. Ukraine was executing a 21st century war of precision and information dominance. And it gets even more serious from here, because this is no longer just about the soldiers on the ground. This is now a state-level catastrophe for the Russian military machine. The human cost is staggering, but the institutional cost is even worse. Russian recruitment centers are already overwhelmed with families demanding answers about missing sons, husbands, and fathers. Over 90,000 active claims for missing personnel moving through military courts. The psychological toll on the remaining forces is incalculable. Soldiers who once marched forward with at least the illusion of support now know the truth. Step into the open and you disappear. Morale has collapsed to the point where entire units are refusing orders. Desertion rates are spiking. And the Kremlin's only response is to throw more untrained bodies into the same meat grinder. Logistically, the system is breaking. Russia's ability to replace these losses is finite. Every disappeared soldier represents not just a human being erased, but a rifle, body armor, training time, and future combat potential removed from the inventory forever. Their artillery stocks, already strained, must now support ever larger and ever more futile assaults just to maintain the appearance of momentum. Their command and control networks, already fragile, are being shredded by Ukrainian electronic warfare that jams communications at the exact moment the drones strike. The Russian army that entered 2026, believing it could still dictate terms in Donetsk, is now bleeding out faster than it can replenish. This brings us to the climactic turning point that is unfolding as we speak. In the past 10 days, Ukrainian forces have executed what I can only describe as a masterclass in modern combined arms annihilation. They identified the primary Russian assembly areas feeding the Pokrovsk axis, large concentrations of troops, vehicles, and supplies staged just behind the forward line. Instead of engaging in the kind of static artillery duel Russia expected, Ukraine unleashed coordinated swarms, hundreds of drones operating in layered waves. First, the reconnaissance layer mapping every position in real time. Then the strike layer, FPVs, Lancet-style loitering munitions, and even modified commercial octocopters carrying heavier payloads. Electronic warfare assets suppressed Russian air defenses and jammed command links simultaneously. The result was systematic. Russian units that moved out of their staging areas were met with immediate, overwhelming precision fire. One documented assault group of nearly 200 men advanced at dawn and was reduced to zero effective combat power within 47 minutes. Not a single soldier made it to the Ukrainian trench line. Not a single body was recovered by Russian forces. The entire group simply ceased to exist as a military formation. And because Ukrainian drones maintained overwatch, any Russian attempt to search for survivors or retrieve remains triggered fresh strikes. This is not hyperbole. This is the new reality of the Donetsk battlefield. Ukraine has created a zone of denial so complete that Russian soldiers are effectively disappearing into it. The horror is not just the casualties, it is the psychological certainty that if you are ordered forward, your fate is erasure, no glory, no honorable death, just absence. What you are witnessing is the final unmasking of Russia's strategic bankruptcy. For 2 years, they have clung to the belief that sheer numbers and brutality would eventually break Ukrainian will. Instead, Ukraine has weaponized technology, adaptation, and superior doctrine to turn those numbers into liabilities. Every Russian soldier sent into Donetsk becomes another data point in Ukraine's learning curve. Every vanished unit teaches the next wave of Ukrainian operators how to be even more efficient. The broader lesson here is crystal clear. Russia did not lose these soldiers because they lacked courage. They lost them because their entire military system, its doctrine, its equipment, its leadership, its assumptions about war belongs to a different century. Ukraine, by contrast, has built a force that learns in real time, adapts in hours, and executes with a precision that turns Russian mass into Russian graves. History will record this period in Donetsk as the moment when the illusion of Russian military power finally shattered beyond repair. The soldiers disappearing without a trace are not just casualties. They are the visible evidence that the Russian war machine is consuming itself, and what happens next changes everything. The Russian high command now faces an impossible choice: continue the assaults and accelerate the collapse, or halt the offensive and admit strategic failure. Either path leads to the same outcome: the irreversible erosion of their ground forces in the east. Ukraine, meanwhile, has demonstrated that it can defend, attrit, and ultimately dismantle a much larger adversary without ever matching it man for man. The war is not over, but the trajectory is now unmistakable. Russian soldiers in Donetsk are not just fighting Ukraine. They are fighting the future of warfare itself, and the future is winning. Stay with us because those questions do not have simple answers. The next phase of this conflict will reveal whether Russia can adapt before it is too late, or whether the disappearances in Donetsk will become the defining image of a military power that simply vanished from the battlefield.